This is a video that's going to give you a brief overview of all the market structures that you need to know for your AQA exam. So the definition of a market structure is really just the characteristics of the market. And actually all markets would be very, very similar to each other if it were not for these depends upon features. So the market structure that you have really depends upon the barriers to entry and exit, and whether there are any barriers and how strong they are. It depends, and this is going to determine, the number of firms that there are in the market. It's going to determine the size of the firms and their market share, because there's only going to be so much revenue or so many customers in that market. So the number of firms that can get into the market will just determine how much of a share they're going to be able to get of those customers. And it's also going to be able to determine whether those firms in the market are price takers or price makers, because if you remember and think back to that presentation, price takers were the firms that were very small in the market. They had a very small market share, and that meant that they just had to accept that market price that was given to them, whereas firms who had a large market share were more likely to be price makers. And it also depends upon the nature of the product as well. So if there are lots of substitutes, we're going to find that they're more likely, and very close substitutes as well, and especially, identical substitutes in the case of homogeneous products, we're going to find that they're price takers, whereas if the product that they're selling is more unique, we're going to see that they're more price makers. So here's the spectrum of market structures, and where we have more competition, the market's less concentrated. Certainly, when we look at concentration ratios for the top 4 or the top 5 firms, it would be a smaller ratio than over here, where there's less competition and therefore the market is more concentrated. So the strength of barriers to entry and exit. In perfect competition, there really shouldn't be any barriers to entry and exit. In monopolies and oligopolies, they are more likely to be strong. Certainly in monopolies, there's going to be many and they're going to be strong. Oligopolies is the difficult market structure, I sometimes call it, because it's sort of like the market structure that is what's left behind. So they came up with kind of perfect competition, and they came up with monopolies, and then they were like, okay, there are some market structures that don't really fit these features of the market. Okay, we'll call them oligopolies. But sometimes you have oligopolies where, they're as you would expect, only a few producers, but then you have really unusual markets like the supermarkets, where you have these big supermarkets, but you also have lots of little markets as well, and lots of little retailers. So the oligopoly is the one usually we'd find quite high barriers to entry, but there's nothing to stop anyone opening up a little stall selling food, is there? So that would be quite straightforward and few barriers to entry. Number of firms in the market, though, this is a bit more clear cut. Monopoly 1, perfect competition, loads, whereas oligopoly usually a few, but again you can have smaller producers as well. Size of the firm, small with perfect competition. The firm is the industry with a monopoly, so they're large. And oligopoly, usually large, but you can have smaller producers as well. Perfect competition, they're a taker, and oligopoly and monopoly, they are makers, because we see a downward sloping demand curve. And the nature of the product is homogeneous in perfect competition. It can be homogeneous in oligopolies, but we tend to see slight differences. We tend to see more non-price competition and branding coming into it with oligopolies, as they try to avoid price competition, a lot of oligopolies, so therefore it'd be more differentiated. So differentiated just meaning that there's slight differences between the models. And then in monopolies, because there's no competition, it's what we'd call a unique product. Now, it's really important. You're going to look at each one of these in detail, but they're really important because the market structure that you have will determine the price that's charged, the equilibrium quantity as well, so this is going to have an impact on consumer and producer surplus, the size, oh, here we go, size of consumer surplus, the size of producer surplus, the amount of profit that's made, whether there's supernormal profit made, whether this is made in the long run. It's going to determine whether the market is productively efficient, whether it's allocatively efficient, whether there are gains that you can get from dynamic efficiencies over time as well. And just remember, just flicking right back to the beginning, it's these two things that are very important. So it's really these barriers to entry and the nature of the product that are going to determine whether the market is perfectly competitive or a monopoly or something in between. You don't have to do monopolistic competition for the legacy exam, but if you're doing this exam 2017 onwards, you would be looking at monopolistic competition.